Good evening. Welcome to all of you who are here. Welcome to all of you watching online. Welcome to all of you who might be watching this 3 weeks from right now, or whenever it might be as time goes. Lord willing, as time goes on, all of our materials will find good use, planting the seed of the Word of God somewhere in somebody's heart. We're talking about kings. We're back to kings tonight. Let's do a little review. Naioth and Ramah, then Jonathan, Ahimelech the priest in Nob. Yes, there was a place named Nob. King Achish of Gath, the cave of Adullam, and Mizpah in Moab. This is like Jeopardy. What do all these things have in common? Anybody? Anybody know but you don't want to say? Well, these are places where he fled as Saul was pursuing him. He went to all of these places, and during the course of these events, he had opportunities to kill Saul, and he never availed himself of killing Saul. Why would David not raise his hand against Saul? He was the Lord's anointed, and David would not lift his hand against the Lord's anointed, nor would he allow anyone else to do so. But these are the places or people to whom he went as he was fleeing from Saul. Why did he go to Jonathan, by the way? Anybody remember? Who was Jonathan? Saul's son. And David went to Jonathan because he was asking him the question, why does your dad want to kill me? I think that's a legitimate question. If somebody wants to kill you, you need to find out, why do they want to kill me? And so he went to Jonathan to find that out. What event seems to show how drastically Saul had fallen from God? What did Saul do? Now, he made several mistakes. He did some things wrong, but there was one thing in particular we talked about last week that he did that really showed his fall from grace, so to speak. Anybody? He killed the priests, 85 priests. Why did he do that? Why did he kill those priests? Okay, David had gone to Nob and he had visited with Ahimelech. It's interesting when you read the text, Ahimelech saw David by himself and he was concerned. It's like Ahimelech knew that David was one of the servants of Saul, and if David's coming to him, he ought to have an entourage, and he's coming by himself. This doesn't look good. What's going on, David? And sure enough, David is a fugitive. He's on the run. So Ahimelech gives David the showbread, the holy bread, for him and his men to eat so they don't starve. What else does he give him? Goliath's sword, which had been stored with the priests in Ramah. And so when Saul found out about that, he considered them turncoats, when actually I don't think Ahimelech knew anything about the fuss between Saul and David. So that's just the way politics goes, is it not? What's something that tells us the true nature of David's character? And we've already talked about this in brief. And that is that he would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. Saul was after him. Saul had tried to kill him twice with a spear, and then he tried to kill him in other ways. He even tried to marry him off to his daughter and say, well, if I can get him to marry my daughter, I'll tell him I want 100 foreskins of the Philistines, and so you got to go fight Philistines, and he'll get killed fighting those guys. And nope. So he wound up with David as a son-in-law. Interesting, I think. Here's a statement in chapter 23, verse 14. If you want to look that up. It says, David stayed in the wilderness in the strongholds and remained in the hill country in the wilderness of Ziph, and Saul sought him every day. But God did not deliver him into his hand. God did not deliver David into Saul's hand. Sometimes I'll read something that's in the Bible and I'll say, why is that there? If you're reading this narrative, doesn't it seem obvious to you that God would not want David delivered into Saul's hand? So why would it be said? Why would the Holy Spirit inspire the writer of Samuel to put that in the text? There's no footnote that explains this, but this is something God wanted us to know as we read this piece of history. It's like God wanted us to know, I'm overseeing this, I'm taking care of this, I'm not going to allow anything bad to happen to David. I don't know that David ever got that memo himself. Have you noticed that about life? You can look back on your life and you see a million things that God has brought you through. And when you were in those things or facing those things, you were probably wondering, man, is this going to kill me? Am I going to make it? How's this going to turn out? It's going to be horrible. Back to when you were in grade school and you thought your whole life hung on the grade of one test, or whether or not one girl would say she liked you. That's the way it is when you're a kid, and it's about that way the rest of your life, just with different things. And how many things has God brought us through? And so when I look at David's life and the horrible situation that he had, he was God's anointed, and yet he was being pursued by the other anointed king, and he was trying to kill him. And his life was not a bed of roses, but God was sustaining him. I forget the guy's name. If we could enlarge that picture, it's at the bottom, but the creator of this statue, I thought that was pretty cool. This is not supposed to be David in the hand of God, but it is a statue that's called In God's Hands, or In God's Hand. And I saw that and I thought, that's great, that'll work. This is the area, present day picture, of course, where David was being pursued by Saul, the wilderness of Kish. Chapter 23, verse 26 says, Saul went on one side of the mountain and David and his men on the other side of the mountain, and David was hurrying to get away. Let's go to that text, chapter 23. Verse 19 says, the Ziphites. You all remember the Ziphites, don't you? They invented the ziffer. So if you ever, okay, well, we'll just go on from there. They came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, is David not hiding with us in the strongholds at Horesh on the hill of Hakilah, which is on the south of Jeshimon? Now then, O king, come down according to all the desire of your soul to do so, and on our part shall be to surrender him into the king's hand. So Saul is pursuing David because these guys have ratted him out. It says in verse 24, they arose and went to Ziph before Saul, and now David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon in the Arabah to the south of Jeshimon. When Saul and his men went to seek him, they told David, and he came down to the rock and stayed in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard it, he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. How'd you like to be in the run in that place? That's some pretty rugged country. Not too many trees to hide behind. But a messenger came to Saul. Verse 27, saying, hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid on the land. So Saul returned from pursuing David and went to meet the Philistines. Therefore they called that place the Rock of Escape. It's interesting how that area got its name, the Rock of Escape. Why did they call it that? Because that's where David escaped from Saul. The place got its name because of what happened between David and Saul. Why did Saul leave? The Philistines had made an attack. How did Saul find out about that? Somehow, a messenger was able to find Saul at just the right time when Saul was on one side of the mountain and David was on the other. And here's David narrowly making his escape, and Saul's probably thinking, I've got him now. It was Star Wars. Remember there was a scene in Star Wars where Darth Vader's in a TIE fighter and he's about to shoot Luke, and you go, I have you now. And that's when a AIM-7 missile came off an F-15 and hit the side of his, and it blew him up, and he flew off. Anyway, if y'all didn't see the movie, it's a great show. You need to watch it. But that's what Saul probably thought. I've got him now. I've been chasing him all this time, and I've got him now. He's over there. We're just about to catch him. And then he gets this message. Now, the text doesn't say that God provoked the Philistines to attack at that particular time. And the text doesn't say that God enabled that messenger to find Saul at that particular time. But it just so happens that everything works out so that just as David is about to be caught, his pursuer's called away. Now, we can call it chance, or we can call it providence. Truth is, we'll never know exactly because the scriptures don't say. But how many times have things like this happened in your life when you thought, man, I'm not going to make it, and then just at the nick of time something happens and you make it? Why is it that this is exactly the way all of our popular stories are, just like Darth Vader chasing Luke? He's just about to get Luke, and boom, He's off. Well, who shoots him? Everybody knows it's Han Solo. Y'all don't watch much Star Wars, do you? But that's every story. Every story is just in the nick of time. Snow White's running through the forest. She thinks she's going to be lost forever. And what does she chance to happen upon but the little dwarf's cottage? Every story is like this. Because life is like this. In my estimation, this is God training us for faith. Training us to have faith. You're going to find yourself in situations you won't think you'll get out of them. You won't think you'll get through them, but you will, and you do. And if we kept a record of that, we'd go back and we'd look at our lives and go, wow, look at everything I've come through. I go back to David himself. Why did David believe he could whip Goliath? What? He had to fight a lion, and then he had to fight a bear. And so when Saul asked him, how do you think you can kill this Goliath? David said, the Lord delivered me from the hand, the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear. He'll deliver me from this Philistine. And sure enough, that's exactly what God did. That's the way God works. That was David's faith. And it seems like as we read this, it's an opportunity for me to learn to have the same kind of faith when I see these things happening to David. Samuel and Abigail. What's going on there? I don't think they ever met. They ever knew each other. But Samuel dies in chapter 25, verse 1. He's buried in Ramah. This is while David is still on the run. Who did David go to? He went to Samuel. Samuel was David's go-to guy. He was the man he looked up to, the spiritual leader. So David encounters Nabal. Not actually. Well, he does, actually. But what happens between David and Nabal? David's men are watching after the servants of Nabal as they watch over their flocks and their herds. And so David says, well, if we're doing this, we ought to be able to beg something off of Nabal. And so he sends messengers, emissaries to Nabal and asks for some sustenance, some food, whatever he's got that he might be able to spare. And Nabal insults him, says, I'm not giving you guys anything. Everybody and his brother's rising up against his master and running off. You're just a rebellious servant of your master. I'm not going to give you anything. David gets angry and he says, you guys put your swords on. We're going to go wipe this guy out. And they're coming on their way. Well, who gets there before David reaches Nabal? Abigail. Who's Abigail? That's Nabal's wife. And Abigail, the scripture says, is beautiful, but she's not just beautiful. What else is she? She's intelligent. She's wise. And if you read this account of her, you'll find out she's got some character. And so she goes to David with an emissary of her own and gifts and things to give David for him and his men. And she bows down before him and begs him to take these things from her and not pay any attention to Nabal because he is a fool. That's what Nabal's name means. So that's what she does. And she prevents David from this unnecessary revenge and violence against Nabal. Nabal then dies. He finds out what just about happened to him and has a hissy fit and dies. And David marries Abigail. Now here's why I put Samuel and Abigail at the top. And I don't know if there's any correlation between these or not, but you think of this yourself. David loses someone very near and dear to him. He loses Samuel, somebody he was relying on and depending on. And he was in need of somebody to rely on and depend on. And then all of a sudden, boom, wow, here's a beautiful, wise woman, could be my wife. And David makes overtures of marriage towards her, and she says, you betcha. And they get married. It also mentions in the text that David had married another woman, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. What's the question we would ask at this point? Probably. Well, that's not the question I was thinking. You better hope Linda's not watching. Anyway, the question I would ask is, hey, what about polygamy? Is that okay with God? There are a lot of things through history, I say a lot, There are things and situations through history that God tolerated that he didn't originally design. But he allowed for those things, and this is one of the things that he allowed for. By the time we get to the point where David sins with Bathsheba, he's already got 7 wives. He doesn't actually have 7 because Saul would give Michal away to another man. But he's got 6 wives left, and it's just an interesting situation. All right, 1 Samuel chapter 28. Saul is now without Samuel. Isn't it interesting that Samuel was also Saul's go-to guy? But now Samuel is gone. The Philistines are attacking again. Do you remember what happened? This was the first problem that Saul had. The enemies of Israel were massing against them. And Samuel had said, you wait until the appointed time, and when I get there, I'll offer sacrifice. And after I offer sacrifice, then you'll go to war. And Saul waited until that day. And Samuel didn't show, he didn't show, he didn't show. And finally, Saul, what did Saul say he did? He forced himself to make the offering. What happened right after he made the offering? Samuel shows up. That's the way of it. Every time, you better wait. God might push it to the nth degree, and that's what happened with Samuel. So that's the point at which Saul really got into trouble, not waiting for the Lord. So now the Philistines are amassing, just like enemies had previously amassed against Israel. And he's talking to the Lord. Lord, what do I do? What do I do? And the Lord doesn't answer him. Why doesn't the Lord answer him? Saul has left the Lord. He's given up on God. He's abandoned him. And so in this abandonment of God, God's, why are you talking to me? One of Saul's servants tells him, hey, there is a woman who is a medium, and she is at Endor. And why are you talking to me, telephone? This is weird. My phone just spoke to me. If you've got a question, just ask. It's a Bible class. We'll answer questions. Now, if you read the text, and I encourage you to do that, it says that Saul had previously gone through the land and wiped out all of the people who dealt with spirits, all the necromancers and the sorcerers and the witches, taking them out. That's in his favor because the scriptures say, if there's a witch, you put her to death. But these guys knew of one that was left. And so instead of Saul saying, hey, why didn't we kill her? He says, well, let's go talk to her. Lord's not talking to me, so I'll resort to a witch. She was a medium at Endor, and since she was a refugee, she was a medium at large. Endor, I know, it's corny. Does that name Endor ring a bell for any 60s situation comedies? Bewitched. Samantha the Witch. What was her mom's name? Endora. That was, I wonder where they got that name. See, that tells you that some people are reading their Bibles. Saul had told the witch when he got there, I want you to bring up Samuel. And Saul had disguised himself so she wouldn't know who he was. And so she brought up Samuel. Let's go to the text and read this. It's interesting. Verse 12. Well, it started 11. Then the woman said, this is 1 Samuel 28, verses 11 and 12. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. And when the woman saw Samuel, so was Samuel there? Yeah, he was there. When the woman saw Samuel, what'd she do? She cried out with a loud voice. Why did she do that? Does it sound to you, would you read this, that she was not expecting to see anybody? That's what it sounds like to me. Now, the text doesn't say. The Holy Spirit didn't fill us in on that. It leaves us to speculate as to why she would cry out. But when she sees Samuel, she cries out. To me, it's almost as if to say, wow, you really are a ghost. I wasn't expecting that. Maybe that's what's going on in her mind. And then she speaks to Saul, and she says, why have you deceived me? You're Saul. She knows what's going on now. She sees it. The king said to her, do not be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being coming up out of the earth. He said to her, what is his form? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he's wrapped with a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did homage. Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? And Saul answered, I'm greatly distressed, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has departed from me and no longer answers me, either through prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have called you, that you may make known to me what I should do. Samuel said, why then do you ask me, since the Lord has departed from you and has become your adversary? What is Samuel saying in essence? If God is not with you, there ain't no point in nothing. If you don't have God, you don't have anything. You don't have any. What are you asking me for? If God's abandoned you, there's no hope. I hope I'm not reading too much into this. What do you think? Samuel said, he goes on to say in verse 17, the Lord has done accordingly as he spoke through me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, to David. As you did not obey the Lord and did not execute his fierce wrath on Amalek, so the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Indeed, the Lord will give over the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. That's a pretty awe-inspiring message. Do you remember that joke about the guy who really loved baseball? And he had a buddy who really loved baseball. And his buddy died. And the night that his buddy died, this guy had a dream about his buddy. And his buddy came to him. And he said, wow, you're alive? He said, yeah, I'm alive. I'm in heaven. And you're going to love it when you get here, because we play baseball all the time. He said, that's great. That's great news. He said, yeah, but I got some bad news. Well, what's that? So, well, you're scheduled to pitch tomorrow night. So, this is Samuel saying, Saul, you and your sons are scheduled to be with me by tomorrow evening. Wow. So here we are. Saul consulting with the witch of Endor because he can't talk to Samuel rather. He's dead. At least he wouldn't have thought he could have talked to Samuel, but here he is talking to him because the Lord's left him. But here's a couple of things in the account that are of interest to me. Chapter 27, verses 5 to 12, David lives among the Philistines, and he pretends to be their ally. But while he's pretending to be their ally, he's making forays, attacking the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. And these are some Arabic tribes out in the desert who've long been enemies of Israel. And he tells Achish is the king of Gath, Philistine king. He tells Achish that he's going out and attacking Judean towns, which would make Achish happy because he's the enemy of Israel and Judea. But that's not what David's doing. What's he doing when he tells Achish that? He is lying through his teeth. Does this mean it's okay to lie? There are things recorded in the Bible that God's people have done that God doesn't necessarily put his stamp of approval on. Although through these things, even through these things, the will of God gets worked out. I would caution anyone against taking this text and saying, well, sometimes it's okay to lie. I wouldn't do that. Regardless of what God thinks of what David has done in this case, I wouldn't make this a case for being dishonest with anyone. Here's another situation. David appears, he's living with the Philistines, so now the Philistines are going to go make war against Israel, and David appears ready with his forces to join forces with the Philistines to make war against Israel. That's what it looks like. But when Gath gathers David with the rest of the Philistine lords, those Philistine lords say, wait a minute, you got an Israelite here. When we get into battle, you know what he's going to do? He's going to turn against us and join his enemies, and we're going to have a turncoat right here in our midst. We don't want David out in this foray. And so Achish tells David, all right, guys, in the morning, take your stuff and go back home. We won't use you this time. And that's exactly what happens. David's excused from battle. But these things are in here. They happen. They're an account of history. But I wanted to bring them to our attention tonight so that as we look at these and we read these, we say, okay, that happened. Was there any other time that David was a little bit deceptive? Remember when he stayed in the Philistine court and he acted like he was crazy? He scribbled on the walls and he let slobber run down his face. And, what are you bringing another crazy man to me for? That's what the Philistine king asked. So sometimes there's been deception practiced, but it's not necessarily something that God promotes. David and the Amalekite job. 1 Samuel chapter 30. Yes.
Any situation that he deems necessary to get the job done.
Right.
Because look at Nebuchadnezzar. You know?
Right.
He was his servant to take Israel into captivity.
That's what he called him. Nebuchadnezzar, my servant. Whether Nebuchadnezzar knew that or not, you don't have to be aware of it to be serving the Lord's purpose. Exactly. And he has through history. And the more history you read, the more you figure out, well, yeah, God did this. This is why it shouldn't be anything strange to us. It really shouldn't be anything new to us when we read Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, where it says, God causes all things to work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. Why do I say that shouldn't be new or strange? Because that's what we've been reading from Genesis 1 up to Romans 8:28. We've been reading God doing this, working everything together for good. Even times, even situations that we would look at and go, I'm not sure Jesus would approve of that. But Steve's point is valid, that God uses situations to work his will, even when we might have some questions about those situations. But God does that without ever making it look like, okay, 21st century Christians, this is how I want you to behave. Bob? Oh, two Bobs. Bob number one.
Also there in Romans, it says that all men have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God.
Yes.
This also shows the vulnerability of mankind with David. He succumbs to the things that we do, to protect ourselves. He's going to act like a crazy man.
Right.
And even there, you see that little fluctuation of faith that he has, which happens to all of us. And I think this is one of the lessons that we go to when we look at David, is that he had that problem, but he kept overcoming it. It was a day and a step at a time. Each time he would do something wrong, he'd try to make allowances for it. And so it's possible.
Okay.
And fulfillment are not necessarily part of the Lord's plan.
Bob is saying our happiness and fulfillment are not necessarily part of the Lord's plan. What is God's plan for you and me? Is it happiness or is it holiness? Holiness. Sanctification, holiness, that is God's plan for you and me. He's not against happiness, but if we make happiness our goal in life, it's an interesting thing about happiness. It's like self-esteem. You don't gain self-esteem by pursuing self-esteem. Self-esteem is a byproduct of something else. It has to be. Happiness is a byproduct of something else. It has to be. You have to do things that result in the freedom to have self-esteem. You have to do the kinds of things that allow you to have happiness. It's interesting to me, as we've studied the fruits of the Spirit here recently, happiness was not one of the fruits of the Spirit. But what is one of the fruits of the Spirit that might sound like happiness? Joy. Joy is a fruit of the Spirit of God. You do not have joy in your life by being lazy. You do not have joy in your life by avoiding all hardship. You do not have joy in your life by taking the easy path. The only way to find true joy is to meet the challenges that God gives you in life every single day. And if that's what we do, if that's how we live, joy is going to be one of the results of that. Self-esteem will be one of the results of that. You don't give children self-esteem by telling them, you're a good little boy. You give children self-esteem by training them how to be a good little boy and then demanding and expecting that they live up to the standard of what is right instead of what is wrong. And when they meet that standard, they'll have self-esteem, and you won't have to tell them to have it. They'll just know. That's the way to have it. And it's the same way with all the good things in life. Questions, comments, observations? Yes?
I was just going to say, one thing's kind of nice. I think when you read, you see the flaws in all the characters in the Bible. I think it's kind of reassuring, and it kind of reinforces the honesty of the text.
Yes.
We're not idealizing any of these individuals. We see the flaws. We see all the mistakes they're making, and to me, it helps reassure me that what we have here is an honest presentation of God's will and God's word.
Absolutely. He's giving us a true record. As a matter of fact, I've said this before, I'll say it again. If you want to see some messed up people, you go to Genesis and you read through Genesis paying attention to all of the families through whom God works. There's some messed up people.
We are.
Oh, come on. Well, just like us? Just like me? Look, I've had a shower. I'm clean. I live in the 21st century. I've got an education. You know I'm just like all those people back in the Bible? And the answer is, absolutely. We are just like them. If God wrote a story about your life, would there be any parts in it that you'd rather folks didn't read? If we could pick and choose what would be in the book, well, okay, yeah, well, maybe so. If we were allowed to write it, well, but we don't get to write it. Because there is a record, and the record is the truth about me, and the record is the truth about you. What is it that Jesus says about every word that comes out of our mouth? He says every idle word is going to be the basis of judgment. That means every idle word of mine has been recorded. And you talk about a scary thought. And I'm trying to do it right. But I'm a mess. And you're trying to do it right. And you're a mess. And David was trying to do it right. And he was a mess. And God was recording the mess. And through all of this, what he's going to do later is say, this is my son Jesus. And he's the son of whom? David, son of David. That's how the Jews look for the Messiah. He would be the son of David. Anyway, it all ties together. Jesus is not ashamed to be our brother. He's not ashamed to be our Savior. He prayed in the 17th chapter of John. I keep going back to this personally and in lessons. He prayed to God that he would be able to show the apostles, and I believe us by association, the glory that he had with the Father before the foundation of the world. That's in the 17th chapter of John as Jesus is praying to the Father. You don't say those things about people that you're just barely tolerating. You say those things about people that you love and appreciate. You want to impress. And that's how Jesus felt about the apostles. And we read about the apostles and we see all the same stuff about them that we see about David, that we know is true about us. And so as we read this history, it's like it's history, but it's just as real for us today in the 21st century. And what time is it? Got my watch. Oh, it's time to quit. All right, what am I looking at here? How many more do I have? Oh, well, we'll just go through this one here. Talking about the Amalekites. Didn't God send Saul against the Amalekites, and what did Saul do? He failed to wipe them out. He brought back the stock, and he brought back the king. He didn't wipe them out. But this is what God had said all the way back in Exodus. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. How did God feel about the Amalekites? Said, I'm in the process of wiping them out, and here's why I want you to do what I want you to do about it. I want you to write it in a book, and I want it to be a memorial. That's an unusual memorial, isn't it? I want this to be something that is remembered. Recite it to Joshua. What do you learn to recite? You recite things that are important to you. Moses built an altar, and he named it, The Lord is my banner. And he said, the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation. That's back in Exodus, because when they were coming out of Egypt, the Amalekites fought against the Israelites, and God said, all right, put it in a book. I'm going to wipe these guys out. Israel did not destroy them when they conquered Canaan. Saul failed to destroy them here, but David, he's going to get the job done in chapter 30. He's going against the Amalekites, and he's going to take them out. Now, when he does that, successful at defeating the Amalekites, they've got all this spoil, and he had 600 men, but 200 of those guys weren't really ready to go into battle. So they stayed with the stuff while 400 guys went out to battle. And those 400 guys, some of them anyway, not all of them, but some of them said, well, we don't want them, those 200, to share in the spoils of this war. And David stepped up, and he showed his leadership, and he showed his spirit of fairness. And he said, you must not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us, who's kept us and delivered into our hand the band that came against us, and who will listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down to the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. This is David stepping up to the plate and telling these guys how it's going to be. Who failed to do that when they went against the Amalekites previously? Saul. Saul listened to the voice of the people. They didn't want to kill all that fine stock. They didn't want to do it like God said. And Saul said, well, okay, we'll compromise a little bit. Besides, we'll take some of that stock and we'll offer it up in sacrifice to God. That's what we'll do. No. What was Samuel's question to him after that? To obey is better than to sacrifice. You better obey. And that's what David is doing. Chapter 31. We read about Saul's death. He's fighting the Philistines again on the mountain of Gilboa. His 3 sons are killed. And it doesn't say that Saul knows this, but the way it's presented, it seems like Saul knows this. Can you imagine being a father of 3 sons? You're in a battle, and you see all 3 of your sons killed in battle, or know that they are killed in battle, including Jonathan. Saul's badly wounded by the enemy archers, so he tells his armor bearer, take my sword and kill me. And the armor bearer says, I'm too scared. I'm not going to kill you. You're the king. And so Saul kills himself. And then, of course, what does the armor bearer do? He also kills himself with his sword. So that's where we are. Saul is gone. David is the anointed of God. And next week, Lord willing, we'll talk about David beginning his reign in earnest. Questions, comments, observations, anything? No, don't say anything. We got to quit. All right, we're done. Bless you for tuning in out there, and bless you all for being here. Lord bless you good.